Mary Tudor, Queen of England from 1553 to 1558. She was known to many as Bloody Mary. Her violent but short reign of only 5 years changed the English history, and quite possibly world history, for years to come. Mary Tudor was the only child born to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Mary was named after Henry's younger sister, and after her christening she went to live in her own household. She had her own personal staff, which interestingly enough were green and blue. She was often a pretty face at court. Her doting father loved to show her off, claiming that she never cried. As she grew up, her features were a combination of her father's fair skin and her mother's gray eyes and both of their red hair. At the age of 2, Mary was engaged to the eldest son of the King of France. Mary's education was of exceptional quality. At an age when most girls received a minimal amount of education, Mary was given the best tutors and studied works of leading scholars and philosophers. She also learned to speak Latin, French, and Spanish, and understood Italian. She learned other skills as well, such as riding side saddle, sewing, and embroidery. After Queen Catherine's last pregnancy resulted in a stillbirth, King Henry took a mistress who bore him a son in 1519, whom he named Henry, and he was created Duke of Richmond and Somerset, among other honors. The young boy was given a princely household, and King Henry ordered him to be put above everyone else at court, even Mary. King Henry sent Mary to Ludlow Castle in Wales. Ludlow was the seat of power usually associated with the Princes of Wales, and from where they governed Wales. Mary, only 9, was on the way to being the future ruler of the great country of England. When Mary returned to court in the year 1527, it was much different. Her father had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. King Henry's plan was to divorce his first wife, Catherine, quietly. He based his argument on an Old Testament text. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall remain childless. Henry reasoned that he had had no son because he and Catherine were living in an adulterous marriage for 18 years. He believed that God was telling him to seek a divorce. In 1529, Catherine was sent from court, never to return. In July of 1531, Henry divorced Catherine, and Anne Boleyn was now at the king's side. By Christmas of 1531, Anne was suspected to be pregnant. So in January of 1533, Henry quietly and quickly married Anne Boleyn. Catherine was shut up in the Kimbolton Castle in one room, and no longer allowed to see her daughter Mary. As a result of Henry's marriage to Anne and banishment of Catherine, Mary lived her teenage years in great confusion. Since King Henry had annulled his marriage with Queen Catherine, Mary was declared illegitimate and was no longer to be called princess, but rather Lady Mary. Mary was not at all happy with the fact that Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, now had the title of princess. Mary was summoned to the castle to take care of Elizabeth. Mary gave all of her jewels to Elizabeth, and King Henry, her father, would not even acknowledge her. At the end of 1535, the old Queen Catherine became ill and died in January 7, 1536. In May of the same year, Anne Boleyn was arrested and tried for adultery. Right before her execution, her marriage to Henry was annulled, and with that, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. Henry's other illegitimate child from his mistress was the Duke of Richmond, who also died in 1536. In the same year, the king sent over to Mary the Duke of Norfolk and the members of the Privy Council to have her sign the Oath of Succession and the Oath of Supremacy. These articles would declare Henry to be the head of the Church of England and declare that her mother's marriage to Henry was unlawful. Mary would not sign it, for she felt that it would be traitorous to her mother. At this, Henry was enraged and wished to send her to the Tower. The councillors asked to be sent to her one more time. Tired and afraid, Mary signed the articles at 11 o'clock at night on Thursday, June 15, 1536. She begged her father to forgive her, and so 6 months later she was allowed to return to the court. Over the course of many years, Henry took more wives. After Anne Boleyn, there was Jane Seymour, who gave birth to Edward in 1537. Mary was the young prince's godmother at his christening. Shortly after Edward's birth, Jane died. Then, in January of 1540, Mary had yet another stepmother, Anne of Cleves. The two women became very good friends. However, the marriage was short-lived, and Anne and Henry's marriage was annulled in July of the same year. Henry took another wife, Catherine Howard, who was only 18 years old, making Mary 6 years older than her stepmother. The reign of Catherine was also short-lived, for she was arrested, tried for adultery in 1542. Henry's last wife and queen was Catherine Parr, who was 4 years older than Mary. Catherine and Henry were married in 1543. All of Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, all attended the wedding. Mary became good friends with Catherine, even though she was a supporter of the Reformed Church. Soon Henry began to fall ill, so he drafted his will. In it, he stated that Edward would be his successor, and Mary was to follow if the prince died childless. Elizabeth was also included. She would take over the throne if Mary died childless. On the 28th of January 1547, King Henry VIII died, and Edward was to be king at the age of 9. Edward had an act of uniformity in place. However, Mary openly defied this by holding Mass in her house. On several occasions, members of Edward's court were sent to Mary's house to stop her from practicing the Roman Catholic faith. Mary would not budge. Finally, weary of dealing with Mary, Edward and his council looked the other way for the rest of Edward's reign. Soon Edward started to show signs of illness in 1553. Fearing that if Mary was queen, the country would return to the Catholic faith. Powerful men such as John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, began to make plans. He married his son to Jane Grey, who would be in line to the throne after Mary and Elizabeth. They thought that by placing Jane on the throne, they would have a puppet to control. Northumberland put his plans into action by convincing Edward to leave his crown to his cousin Jane. Mary soon realized that a plot was being made to place Jane on the throne. She feared for her life. Mary knew that if she fled, she would forfeit her title as queen. So she chose to stay and fight for her title. After a horrible battle with what was probably tuberculosis, the young king died on the 6th of July, 1553, at the age of 15. Shortly afterwards, Northumberland told Jane that Edward had left the crown to her, and she was now the Queen of England. Mary went to a castle in Suffolk with her numerous supporters. Soon the Privy Council in London realized their error in going along with Northumberland's plan, and declared Mary the true Queen of England on July 19, 1553, only 13 days after Edward's death. At the beginning of her reign, Mary acted slowly on the issue of religion. She allowed her brother to be buried in Westminster Abbey with a Protestant service while she attended a private mass in his memory. Her first Parliament meeting on the 5th of October was when she reversed the divorce of King Henry and her mother by declaring it lawful. In January of 1554, there was something started called the Wyatt Plot. Sir Thomas Wyatt marched to London. He was not against Mary's reign, but against the Spanish match of her marrying Prince Philip. The Wyatt Plot came dangerously close to being a success. However, he got to the gates of Whitehall Palace and surrendered. After the Wyatt Plot, the support for the death of Lady Jane Grey became great. The threat was not Jane herself, but as long as she lived, Mary would not be safe. For there were those that wished to depose Mary and restore Jane to the throne. Mary Tudor's advisors continued to try to persuade her to get rid of Jane Grey. They reasoned that as long as she remained alive, plots for Mary's death would exist. Mary tried to avoid having Jane killed. She asked Lady Jane to convert to Roman Catholicism, and that if she did, her life would be spared. Lady Jane refused to do so. Prince Philip of Spain was trying to make his marriage to Mary conditional that Lady Jane be killed. Finally, Mary gave in and had Lady Jane killed. In early 1554, in the Tower of London, the deed was done. In the summer of 1554, Prince Philip of Spain sailed to England to wed Mary Tudor. Mary was 38 and Philip was 27. The marriage took place on July 25th, which was St. James' Day in Spain. Thomas Cranmer, former Archbishop of London, had crossed Mary's path very badly. It was he who had annulled the marriage of her parents. He had stripped her of her royal title. Perhaps Cranmer had believed that annulling the marriage was the proper thing to do during Mary's reign. But once Mary ascended the throne, he repented right away. Mary was still very enraged. In her mind, he was the reason of years of shame and suffering, and she must pay him back for it. Blood was the only thing that would satisfy her. Hugh Latimer, the Bishop of Worcester, refused to recant his Anglican beliefs, and Nicholas Ridley, Bishop of London, also continued to practice Anglicanism. The three men, Cranmer, Latimer, and Ridley, were all put on trial in St. Mary's University Church in Oxford. They were convicted and burned to death in 1554. Cranmer recanted, which bought him a little time. However, Mary Tudor decided that no amount of words would pacify the situation. He was found guilty, and it was now time for him to pay for his crimes. He was taken to the same spot that Ridley and Latimer had died, and he met his maker in 1555. Mary Tudor earned the name Bloody Mary because of the persecution of the Anglicans during her reign. She was much bloodier than her brother Edward and sister Elizabeth. However, she was not as bad as her father, King Henry. It has been said that he killed over 100,000 of his own people during his reign. There were Anglicans that wished to overthrow the throne and put Elizabeth on the throne instead of Mary. Mary's ministers tried to convince her to kill Elizabeth. However, Mary would only banish Elizabeth to the Tower of London. Mary tried to root out the heretics in her nation. Anglicans were caught expressing her heretical beliefs. They were given chances to recognize the error of their ways. If they did not, they were burned at the stake. In 1558, Mary announced that she was pregnant. She was quite happy, for she would have an heir to the throne. However, it was not a child in her womb, but only cancer. In 1558, it became quite obvious she was terminally ill with cancer of the ovaries. On the 17th of November, 1558, she died and was buried in Westminster Abbey.